Now, Nehemiah, I think this is the time that maybe not everyone knows what is important about 1776 and this silver round that you had minted, 1 troy ounce of pure silver. Yep. And what does 1776 have to do with this?
So we have been searching now for over 2 years for manuscripts with the full vowels. Up until about 2 years ago, I had 5 manuscripts that had the full vowels of the name Yehovah. Most manuscripts, one of the vowels missing, but I had 5 where the full vowels Yehovah are in there. The doors broke open when they started digitizing manuscripts, and within about a year, we had 1,000 manuscripts. I did the announcement with Michael Rood, 1,000 manuscripts with a full vowel. As of today, as of this recording, we have 1,776 manuscripts with the full vowel. Yes. The team has been hard at work. T-Bone has been cranking out more and more manuscripts. He actually went through a section of something like 300 manuscripts, and only 2 or 3 of them had the full vowels. So, you might expect the first year we got 1,000, the second year we'd get another 1,000, but no, sometimes that's not how it goes, right? You go through manuscript after manuscript and you don't find the name with full vowels, and then all of a sudden you do. So we're up to 1776. It also so happens that silver round there was minted by the King of Denmark in the 1640s, and it has Yehovah's name on it. The original was that it's based on this Danish coin from the 1640s that was used in Denmark, and this was the emblem of the King of Denmark, of Christian IV of Denmark. The name Yehovah with the phrase Justus Judex, which means righteous judge. It's a phrase from the Bible. And this was actually a fulfillment of a prophecy of Malachi. Malachi chapter 1, verse 11, he says, "My name is great among the nations. From the rising of the sun to the place of its setting, my name is great among the nations." And when people heard this in the 5th century, around the year 400 BC, from the mouth of Malachi, I can't imagine that they understood that as far away as Denmark and Iceland and all the way across an ocean they didn't even know existed about, God's name, Yehovah, would be glorified. So I look at that Danish coin from the 1640s as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That's why I had a replica minted with the front, and on the back put the verse from Malachi. It's an amazing witnessing tool. I hear from people now all over the world who travel around and meet people, and they show them this replica, this silver round, showing them how one of Malachi's prophecies was fulfilled 2,000 years after the prophet spoke his words in Denmark. It was actually all over Europe as well. Now, when the United States was founded, there was no official currency, and the standard currency they used was called the Spanish piece of 8. And then they wanted to say what other coins would be accepted by the U.S. Treasury, so Thomas Jefferson was commissioned to put out a report and assay all the coins. And one of the coins he explicitly mentions is the ducat of Denmark. This coin with Yehovah's name on it was one of the few coins that was accepted as official currency when the United States was founded, and this was in 1776.
1776.
Yep.
So I stepped outside of my authority and I asked T-Bone, please don't look for any more until after Passover next month, the real Passover. I'll tell you, this is great. When we talk about manuscripts, we have found no ancient Greek manuscripts that say that Jesus didn't heal a man who was lame for 38 years, or that Yeshua didn't heal a man who was born blind. We're dealing with minutia, but this minutia is whether the scriptures fit together or not. Whether we can get back to that word which holy men of God wrote as they were moved by the Holy Spirit, or if we are just going to be subject to interpolations that have been passed down to us, and insertions that have been passed down. And that is what I think is so valuable about what these 2 gentlemen have done. There is no way that I could repay them for what they've done in backing up what I knew to be real. And Nehemiah traveled with me for 45 cities as I gave my rendition of what the original Hebrew Matthew must have said, that Joseph was the father of Miriam, not only Joseph, the son of Eli, the husband of Miriam, as it is in Luke, but that Yosef was the father. Yosef ben Yaakov was the father of Miriam. And he listened to me night after night, 45 cities. And then a couple years later at Yom Teruah, he brought me the manuscript, the picture, the photograph of the manuscript, the two oldest Hebrew manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew that include the correct genealogy of Yeshua through Yosef ben Yaakov, the father of Miriam, of whom was born Yeshua, making Yeshua the 14th generation from the carrying away to Babylon unto the Messiah, just as it says even in the Greek. But the Greek only has 13 generations. The Hebrew that Nehemiah found has 14 generations in it, and this is something that I get to teach all the time because this was the $10,000 question that the rabbis presented to me over 20 years ago. And so now these gentlemen are going to take us on the rest of this journey as we are in now the Gospel of John.
That's right. So, I just want to kind of reiterate what Michael said. It's a really important point. We're looking at John 6:4, and we found out that in the 2nd century AD, there were some manuscripts that did not have John 6:4, and the proof of that is these church fathers. We saw it in Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyon, and Origen, and there's others that we couldn't even get to. And this was been recognized for hundreds of years by Christian scholars, right? This is something that's been discussed and debated and recognized. 1643 is our earliest reference to the debate. But there is no manuscript anywhere of the New Testament where there's a textual variant where it says Jesus is not the Messiah. That manuscript doesn't exist. There is no manuscript of the New Testament where it says that Yeshua did not rise on the 3rd day. That manuscript doesn't exist, right? So what we are really talking about are some of these details, and the same could be said of the Tanakh. There are Tanakh manuscripts, for example, where instead of Yehovah, it says Adonai, or Adonai, it says Yehovah. We'll see an example perhaps later. But we don't have any manuscripts of the Tanakh where it says that Moses didn't write the Torah. Right? Every single manuscript agrees that Moses wrote the Torah and that God appeared to the Israelites, 600,000 men and many other women and children at Mount Sinai and spoke directly to them. Every single manuscript of the Bible that exists preserves that record. And so what we're really talking about here are some of the finer details, and those details can be important to people because if you want to understand the chronology, then Michael has presented a possibility. And really my question from the very beginning is, could Michael be right? I don't need to prove if he's right. That comes from what I call the explanatory scope. He can explain all these details and all this information about the Gospels, which otherwise seem like random events, which have, it's kind of jumbled. And look, people have been doing this for centuries. In the 2nd century, there's a man named Tatian who took the 4 Gospels and tried to put them in a chronological order. And so this is something Christian scholars have been doing for many, many centuries. Michael has attempted to do it. John 6:4 did not fit into his model. And now we're looking at the evidence for whether that is supported or not. Now, we talked about Origen, who was the 2nd century church father, lived at the end of the 2nd century. And he talks about the ministry of Yeshua being 1 year. And then he says other statements which make it clear he does not have John 6:4 in his gospel at that time. Now, at the end of Origen's life, it is argued by those who support the 3.5-year ministry, such as George Ogg. We mentioned his book before. It's a really good book. You should get it on Amazon.com. And Ogg argues that Origen not only had the 1-year ministry early in his life, but later in his life, he actually advocated for a longer ministry. In fact, a 3.5 or 3 years, possibly even a 3-year ministry.
He doesn't actually detail the length of the ministry.
Well,
but
he makes nearly 3 years.
So the proponents of a 3.5-year ministry will cite Origen as the oldest source for 3.5 years.
And they'll say about 3 years.
Which is important because even they acknowledge that it's hard to find sources older than that. There's Melito of Sardis as a source that's cited, but it's disputed. So even for a proponent of the 3.5-year ministry, Origen is often cited as the oldest source, and it comes from some statements he made about Daniel,
which we'll get to in a minute, but
where they deduce he's got a chronology longer. Right. He never refuted what he said originally, and the statements that he does say that you can deduce he may have extended the ministry of Yeshua, none of them were based on anything to do with counting Passovers. There's no reason to think that his text had changed. It was an allegorical interpretation of Daniel.
Right. Now, for example, we mentioned Tatian, who was this church father in the 2nd century. He wrote this book called the Diatessaron, where he took all 4 Gospels and put them what he thought was chronological order, and he includes John 6:4. However, we only have the Arabic translation of Tatian's Diatessaron. We don't have that passage in the original, as far as I was able to find, at least. And the point is, every time we have one of these 2nd century sources, these are always disputed sources. Perhaps the only exception is P66 and P75 that we'll get to. But let's start with Origen. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Michael, can you read that? Because Origen's commenting on that.
And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspread of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate.
Now, Origen, in his allegorical commentary on Daniel, took this to be a 70-year period. That 7, or that week, he somehow took to be a 70-year period. And he said that 70-year period is punctuated in the middle with the death of Christ. That is, the first 35 years were from the advent of Jesus all the way up into his death. And then the second 75 years was from the resurrection until the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So because of that, he needs the death of Yeshua to be approximately the year 35, or if he thought the temple was destroyed in 68, that's not clear either, then 2 years earlier, then 33. Unfortunately, we were not able to get a hold of what Origen actually wrote. This has survived, as far as we can tell, in Latin, and we were not able to get a hold of the Latin text. We couldn't, we didn't get it. I mean, we did the best we could. We were dealing with these databases, and look, this is an ongoing project, people. We actually are going to continue this study after this teaching. John's goal is to look at every single manuscript that exists and to see if it has John 6:4 or not. And he actually wants you to contact him. He has an email, which he got, which is john64@gmail.com. But it's the number 6. Everything else is spelled out. And he's going to continue this project. I'm going to help him as well. We're going to continue, and we're going to find out how many manuscripts actually really have John 6:4 and how many don't. We're going to show you what we know today. Everything we're saying is just based on what we know today, and that could change.
And beyond the Greek, the Old Latin, there's other languages that have preserved the manuscripts, not just the Greek manuscripts.
We might find out there's all kinds of languages where John 6:4 is missing. We already know of one, but we're not going to share that today. We don't have time to get to that. So Origen on Daniel 9:27 has this allegorical interpretation which breaks up the 7 into 70 years, which is 35 and 35. And it's inferred from that, to the best that we can tell, that he takes Yeshua's ministry to be about 3 years. And there's a second statement where he also seems to indicate that later in his life. These were books that were written towards the end of Origen's life. And so he may be the first one who has a ministry that's about 3 years. And he's already in the 2nd century. So that is not 100% clear, but it does seem from what we've seen, that seems to be the case. The first one we know for sure that has a 3.5-year ministry, indisputably, is Eusebius of Caesarea, who lived from 260 to 340 approximately. Eusebius is famous from the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he was one of the main spokesmen. And he was also the court historian of Constantine. Tell us a little bit about Eusebius.
Well, I think Eusebius is the one figure that we know most about. He was a student of Pamphilus, and Pamphilus was a student of Origen. So he's a disciple of Origen's disciple. And as relates to this allegorical interpretation of Daniel that Eusebius comments on, there's a relationship between what he says and what Origen said. It's important to note that Pamphilus, he wrote an apology for Origen after Origen died. Eusebius actually had to finish Pamphilus's apology for Origen because Pamphilus was killed as well. So he had to write the last book of the apology for Origen. In Pamphilus's apology for Origen, he quotes the same thing that Origen wrote in First Principles about the 1-year ministry. So Origen, even though he had this allegorical interpretation, his disciples still took away the idea of a 1-year ministry and continued to write on the 1-year ministry and even defended it in their works.
And remember, if there's a 1-year ministry, you can't have John 6:4 in the gospel.
So Eusebius, his interpretation, and Nehemiah is going to show the slide, but his interpretation is connected to Origen's interpretation. Origen looked at the week of Daniel, and he wanted to fill that week out with years in between the advent of Yeshua and the destruction of the temple. He wanted 35 and 35. He wanted to split the week, and Eusebius does something similar to what Origen does.
Now, before we get to Eusebius's explanation of the length of the full 3.5 years, let's see how he explains John. Because we already brought a quote from Eusebius, which says that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were 1 year. So how could John be 3.5? The Gospel of John be 3.5 years? So here's what he says. This is Eusebius. The three Gospels already mentioned having come into the hands of all and into John's too. So that's really interesting. Eusebius is writing this book called The Church History. He's the first one really to do this. And a lot of what we know about the early period of the church comes from Eusebius. Now, that's a good thing, but there's also a danger in there because Eusebius chose only to share what he thought was appropriate to share. There are all kinds of things Eusebius didn't tell you about because he either didn't think they were relevant or he thought they were maybe even from his perspective heretical. Like where are all these Jewish believers in Yeshua who are keeping the Torah? Eusebius doesn't tell you a whole lot about that. He tells you about Papias. I've talked in my teaching the Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. I quote Papias. What I'm really quoting is Eusebius quoting Papias. A lot of these books were destroyed, and our only remnant of them comes from Eusebius' church history. So it's a very important book for understanding the first 3 centuries after Yeshua. He says the 3 Gospels already mentioned having come into the hands of all and into John's too. So according to Eusebius' information, John read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's incredible because the way it's presented in secular scholarship is Luke was written for one church and Matthew was written for another, and a third church had John, and the people who read John didn't know about Luke. That's not how Eusebius presents it. They say that John accepted them and bore witness to their truthfulness, but that there was lacking in them an account of the deeds done by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. So in other words, there was a part of the ministry that John had to fill in the blanks, and everything that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but is in John, let's say other than the last few days, right? That's obviously at the end. Everything else is before Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He goes on, John accordingly in his gospel records the deeds of Christ, which were performed before John the Baptist was cast into prison. But the other 3 evangelists mention the events which happened after that time. This is according to Eusebius. Now, we're not saying we agree with this, but it shows you in a sense how forced Eusebius' position is. He's got to fit every event in John that's not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke into before the 1-year ministry, which he acknowledges. Now, the whole period of our Savior's teaching and working of miracles is said to have been 3.5 years, which is half a week. So where is he getting the half a week? John 9:27. So his teacher's teacher, as well as his teacher, took John 9:27 allegorically, meaning Origen took that allegorically as 70 years. He says, no, a week is 7 years, not 70 years. And half of that week is the teaching of Yeshua on earth before the crucifixion. And he says, John the evangelist in his gospel makes this clear to the attentive. And that's really important. We got to stop there for a minute. When Eusebius says John the evangelist in his gospel makes this clear that ministry is 3.5 years, he means, look, I'm interpreting this allegorically, but I can find it in John even without the allegory. So where is Eusebius finding this? Where is he getting 3.5 years from the Gospel of John? Doesn't say Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He agrees that's 1 year. Where does he get it from the Gospel of John? Well, the first and the last Passover we all know about, John 2 and John 12. We've talked about that. John 5, he evidently took to be, the unnamed feast, he took to be a Passover, and he must have had John 6:4 as a Passover. That's what he's referring to when he says John makes this clear to the attentive, right? It's not explicit, but you can turn John 5, the unnamed feast, into a Passover, and then you get 3 years and change. That's where he's getting it from. Okay, is that clear? Mm-hmm. Everybody's agreeing on this? All right. Goes on. This is Eusebius. 1 week of years, therefore, would be represented by the whole period of his association with the apostles. Both the time before his passion, meaning the crucifixion, and the time after his resurrection. Did you hear what he just said? Let's finish. For it is written that before his passion, he showed himself for the space of 3.5 years. Where is that written? In John, if you take John 5, the unnamed feast to be a Passover, and John 6:4 is another Passover, then you get 3 years and change. That's what he means for it is written. Let's see, the space of 3.5 years to his disciples and also those who were not his disciples. But after his resurrection, he was most likely with his disciples a period equal to the years, being seen of them 40 days and eating with them and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God, as the Acts of the Apostles tell us. So according to Eusebius, Yeshua was 3.5 years before the crucifixion and then 3.5 years after the resurrection.
The 7, yeah, there's you got
Someone in the
week.
audience said, what?
Yeah. That's where you got a 3.5. That's where you got a 3.5 year ministry. You got to accept the 7 years too.
So the origin of the or I shouldn't say the origin, because he is connecting it to John by reading John 5 and John 6 as Passovers, but his model of the ministry is that this is based on Daniel 9:27, that 1 week. Yeshua is cut off in the middle of the week, and then there's another 3.5 years after the resurrection, not really mentioned in the New Testament, right? Because we've got the 40 days, right? And we have various scenes, but 3.5 years?